The morning of January 22, 1944, began like any other cold winter day along the Italian coast. But for Lieutenant Giuseppe Ferrara of the 2nd Armored Regiment, it would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt Italian tank crews for the remainder of the war. The peaceful Mediterranean waters near Anzio suddenly erupted with the thunder of Allied naval guns as thousands of American and British troops began pouring ashore in what would become Operation Shingle. Giuseppe stood frozen beside his M1340 tank, watching the horizon fill with more ships than he had ever seen in his entire military career. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's puppet state in northern Italy, had placed its faith in tanks that were already obsolete when the war began. Giuseppe's M1340, nicknamed Leone by his crew, was armed with a 47mm gun that had proven inadequate against even the lightest Allied armor. The tank's riveted construction and thin armor plating of just 30mm made it vulnerable to almost any anti-tank weapon the Americans possessed. Yet these were the machines that Italian tankers were expected to use against the most powerful military force the world had ever assembled. Sergeant Marco Benedetti, Giuseppe's gunner, climbed out of the turret and approached his commander with a grim expression. The sound of distant explosions rolled across the coastal plain like approaching thunder. "Sir, reconnaissance reports American armor landing on the beaches," Marco said, his voice barely steady. "They're saying these are the new Sherman tanks we've heard about." Giuseppe felt his stomach tighten. Stories had filtered through from veterans of the North African campaign about the American M4 Sherman medium tank, a machine that outclassed Italian armor in every measurable category. The Italian tanks were products of a nation that had entered the Second World War woefully unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. While Germany had invested heavily in panzer development and the Soviets had produced the revolutionary T-34, Italy's industrial capacity and military doctrine had failed to keep pace with the rapid evolution of armored combat. The M1340 weighed only 14 tons compared to the Sherman's 30 tons, and its engine produced only 125 horsepower against the Sherman's 400. These weren't just numbers on a specification sheet. They represented the difference between life and death for the men who would crew these obsolete machines. According to historian Rick Atkinson's Pulitzer Prize-winning work, The Day of Battle, The War in Sicily and Italy, 1943 to 1944, Italian armored units at Anzio faced an impossible situation from the moment Operation Shingle commenced. Atkinson documents how Italian tankers, despite their courage and determination, found themselves equipped with vehicles that belonged to an earlier era of warfare. By mid-morning, Giuseppe's regiment received orders to move toward the beachhead and engage the Allied forces. As Leone rumbled forward along the muddy coastal roads, Giuseppe watched his crew's faces in the dim interior light. Driver Paolo Romano gripped the controls with white knuckles. Loader Antonio Russo methodically checked their ammunition supply, counting shells they all knew would likely prove ineffective against American armor. Radio operator Franco Moretti maintained contact with regimental headquarters, relaying updates that grew increasingly desperate with each transmission. The countryside around Anzio had transformed into a landscape of war within hours of the Allied landing. Smoke columns rose from burning buildings, and the constant rumble of artillery created an apocalyptic soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. Giuseppe's tank column moved through abandoned farmhouses and olive groves that had stood for centuries, now reduced to obstacles and cover positions in a modern battlefield. The men inside Leone knew they were heading toward an engagement they were ill-equipped to win, but military discipline and a sense of duty to their comrades pushed them forward into the gathering storm of steel and fire that awaited them along the Anzio beachhead. The afternoon of January 23, 1944, brought Giuseppe Ferrara's 2nd Armored Regiment into position along the Mussolini Canal, a drainage ditch that Benito Mussolini had ordered constructed in the 1930s to reclaim the Pontine marshes. Now this symbol of fascist engineering ambition would become the setting for one of the most one-sided armored engagements Italian forces would experience during the entire war. Giuseppe positioned Leone behind a stone farmhouse, using the structure for concealment while his crew prepared for their first encounter with American armor. Through his commander's cupola, he could see the flat coastal plain stretching toward the sea, where Allied forces continued to pour men and equipment ashore with industrial efficiency. Sergeant Marco Benedetti studied the approaches through his gun sight, calculating distances and angles of fire with the precision of a veteran tanker. The 47mm gun might be inadequate, but Marco knew every trick to maximize its limited capabilities. He would need to aim for track assemblies, vision ports, or the thin rear armor if Italian tanks had any hope of damaging a Sherman. Antonio Russo had stacked their best armor-piercing rounds within easy reach, though everyone aboard Leone understood that even these enhanced projectiles would struggle to penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at combat ranges. The radio crackled with reports from other Italian units along the defensive line. Several reconnaissance vehicles had already engaged American infantry advancing inland from the beaches. Then came the transmission that sent ice through Giuseppe's veins. American armor spotted, moving north along the coastal highway. Count is 5. No, 7. Correction. At least 10 Sherman tanks advancing in formation. Franco Moretti repeated the message to ensure everyone heard it clearly. Paolo Romano tested the engine response, ready to maneuver at a moment's notice. The crew of Leone settled into the tense waiting that preceded combat, each man alone with his thoughts about what the next hours might bring. The first Sherman appeared around the bend in the road at 1400 hours, its distinctive angular profile immediately recognizable even at a distance of 800 meters. Giuseppe watched through his binoculars as more Shermans followed, advancing with the confidence of a force that knew it possessed overwhelming superiority. The American tanks moved in a tactical formation that spoke of professional training and combat experience. Their commanders stood tall in their cupolas, scanning for threats with practiced efficiency. These were not inexperienced troops stumbling into battle, but veterans of campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, men who had already proven themselves against German panzers and Italian defenders alike. Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Weber of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division had positioned his German tanks alongside the Italian defenders, and his voice came across the radio frequency with characteristic Prussian precision. "Italian units will engage on my command," Weber ordered, his tone making clear that he expected the Italians to serve primarily as a screening force, while German armor maneuvered for killing shots. Giuseppe bristled at the implicit condescension, but acknowledged the tactical reality. German tanks were better equipped for this fight, though even they faced challenges against the numerous and well-supported American armor. Marco called out ranges as the Shermans advanced closer. 700 meters, 650, 600. Giuseppe waited, knowing their only advantage lay in the element of surprise and the first shot. At 500 meters, he gave the order. "Fire!" The 47mm gun barked, and Marco's round struck the lead Sherman's frontal armor with a bright spark. The shell bounced harmlessly away, failing to penetrate. The Sherman column immediately halted, commanders dropping into their turrets as the American tanks pivoted to identify the threat. Return fire came within seconds, a 75mm high-explosive round that demolished the corner of the farmhouse Giuseppe was using for cover, showering Leone with stone fragments and dust. "Reverse! Get us out of here!" Giuseppe shouted as Paolo threw the transmission into reverse gear. The underpowered engine struggled to move the tank quickly enough. Another American round struck the ground 3 meters to their left, the explosion rocking Leone violently. Marco fired again, this time aiming for the tracks of the nearest Sherman, but the shot went wide as Paolo struggled to keep the tank stable while reversing. The Americans advanced systematically, their superior firepower and armor allowing them to dominate the engagement completely. 2 other Italian tanks in Giuseppe's platoon burned nearby, victims of accurate American gunnery that had penetrated their thin armor with contemptuous ease. The realization struck Giuseppe with crushing force. They were not merely outmatched, but hopelessly, catastrophically overmatched in every dimension of armored combat. The evening of January 24, 1944, found Giuseppe Ferrara's battered tank company withdrawing through the Alban Hills, the volcanic mountains that dominated the landscape southeast of Rome. Leone had miraculously survived the disastrous engagement at the Mussolini Canal, but 6 of the regiment's 12 tanks now lay burning on the coastal plain, their crews either dead or captured by advancing American forces. Giuseppe stood in his cupola as Paolo guided the tank along a narrow mountain road, watching the orange glow of fires around the Anzio beachhead reflected against the night clouds. The Allied invasion had achieved complete surprise, and Italian and German forces scrambled to contain the expanding perimeter before the Americans could break out toward Rome. The crew's mood inside Leone had transformed from nervous anticipation to bitter resignation. They had witnessed firsthand the technological chasm separating their equipment from American armor. Marco Benedetti cleaned his gun sight with methodical precision, but his hands trembled slightly as he worked. The memory of watching his rounds bounce harmlessly off Sherman armor, while American shells tore through Italian tanks like they were made of cardboard, had shaken him profoundly. Antonio Russo sat quietly, staring at the remaining ammunition that suddenly seemed more symbolic than practical. Franco Moretti maintained radio discipline, but his transmissions lacked their earlier crispness. The Italian Social Republic's military leadership had established a command post in the town of Velletri, nestled in the Alban Hills. Here, officers from various units gathered to assess the disaster unfolding along the coast. Giuseppe attended the briefing after securing Leone, in a camouflaged position beneath olive trees. The scene inside the requisitioned villa was chaotic, with junior officers shouting contradictory reports, while senior commanders studied maps with expressions ranging from concern to outright panic. Colonel Vittorio Castelli, the regiment's commanding officer, spotted Giuseppe and waved him over. "Lieutenant Ferrara, I need your first-hand assessment," Castelli said, his weathered face showing the strain of the past 48 hours. Giuseppe provided a brutally honest, tactical analysis, describing how the Shermans had methodically destroyed Italian defensive positions with a combination of superior firepower, better armor protection, and overwhelming numbers. Castelli listened without interruption, then asked the question that military professionals always dreaded. "Can we stop them?" Giuseppe chose his words carefully. "Not with our current equipment, sir. The M1340 is simply inadequate for engaging Sherman tanks. We need German support, anti-tank guns, anything that can actually penetrate their armor." A German liaison officer, Captain Franz Müller from Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's staff, had overheard the conversation. He approached with a map case under his arm and a grim expression. "Field Marshal Kesselring is moving additional units to contain the beachhead," Müller explained in accented Italian. "Panzer divisions from the Gustav Line will redeploy north. Your Italian armor will provide reconnaissance and infantry support." The implication was clear. German commanders had no confidence in Italian tanks engaging American armor in direct combat. The Italian tankers would be relegated to secondary roles while German panzers handled the real fighting. Historical accounts from the United States Army Center of Military History document how the Anzio landings caught Axis forces completely unprepared, but German reinforcements arrived with remarkable speed, transforming what could have been a rapid Allied breakthrough into a 4-month stalemate. The Italian contribution to this defense, while often overlooked in post-war histories, involved thousands of soldiers who fought despite inadequate equipment and declining morale as their nation disintegrated around them. Giuseppe returned to Leone as dawn broke over the Alban Hills on January 25th. His crew had managed a few hours of sleep, though Paolo's face showed the marks of nightmares. They gathered around a small fire, brewing ersatz coffee from roasted grain that tasted nothing like real coffee, but provided warmth and a moment of normalcy. Marco spoke what they were all thinking. "We can't win this fight. Not against those tanks. Not with what we have." Giuseppe understood the sentiment, but also understood his duty. "We don't have to win," he replied quietly. "We just have to survive long enough for the Germans to stabilize the situation. Keep our heads down, support the infantry, avoid direct engagements with American armor." The strategic situation around Anzio had evolved rapidly. American Major General John Lucas, commanding the 6th Corps that had landed at Anzio, had chosen to consolidate his beachhead rather than immediately push inland toward Rome. This cautious approach gave Axis forces precious time to rush reinforcements to the area. For Giuseppe and his crew, this meant more days of combat in a tank they now knew was a death trap against American armor. The psychological burden of this knowledge weighed heavily on every Italian tanker. They would climb into their obsolete machines each morning knowing that any encounter with a Sherman could be their last, while lacking the firepower to defend themselves effectively. The morning of February 3rd, 1944, brought renewed American offensive operations as Allied forces attempted to break out from the Anzio beachhead toward the town of Campoleone, a critical rail junction along the Rome to Anzio railway line. Giuseppe Ferrara's tank company had been assigned to support German infantry defending the approaches to the town, a role that kept them away from direct confrontation with American armor but exposed them to artillery fire and infantry anti-tank weapons. Leone occupied a position in a destroyed farmyard, its thin armor providing minimal protection against the American 105mm howitzer shells that fell with increasing frequency across the defensive positions. The crew had developed new survival tactics based on their devastating first encounter with Sherman tanks. Paolo Romano kept the engine running constantly, ready for immediate withdrawal at the first sign of American armor. Marco Benedetti had given up any hope of engaging Shermans directly, instead focusing his gunnery skills on supporting infantry with high explosive rounds against American foot soldiers and soft-skinned vehicles. Antonio Russo maintained a careful watch through the vision ports, acting as an early warning system. Franco Moretti monitored multiple radio frequencies, listening for any reports of Sherman movements that might threaten their position. The battle for Campoleone developed into a brutal close-quarters fight as American infantry, supported by their tanks, pushed against German and Italian defensive lines. Giuseppe watched through his cupola as American soldiers advanced in short rushes, using the broken terrain for cover. German machine gunners cut down the attackers in devastating bursts, but more Americans kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. Then came the call Giuseppe had been dreading. Enemy armor advancing from the south, 4 Sherman tanks providing close support to their infantry. Colonel Castelli's orders came immediately over the radio. All tanks withdraw to secondary positions. Do not engage American armor directly. Repeat, do not engage. Giuseppe didn't need to be told twice. Paolo, get us out of here. Use the covered route we scouted yesterday. The driver expertly maneuvered Leone through the ruins of the farm, using buildings and walls to mask their movement from the advancing Shermans. Behind them, Giuseppe heard the distinctive crack of German 75mm anti-tank guns engaging the American tanks. The PaK-40 guns, superior to anything the Italians possessed, stood a fighting chance against the Shermans. Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a German tank commander Giuseppe had befriended during the previous week, provided a running commentary over the radio as his Panzer IV engaged the advancing Shermans. Good penetration on the lead tank. He's burning. Second Sherman turning to engage. Impact on our frontal armor but no penetration. Firing again. The professional calm in Hoffmann's voice contrasted sharply with the life-and-death struggle taking place. Even the German tanks, superior to Italian armor in every way, faced a difficult fight against the numerous and well-supported American Shermans. Giuseppe positioned Leone in a new defensive location, a stone barn that offered better concealment than their previous position. From here, they could observe the battle without being directly exposed to American fire. What he witnessed reinforced every lesson from their first encounter. The Shermans operated with a combination of firepower, protection, and tactical sophistication that made them formidable opponents. They moved in coordination with infantry, provided mutual support, and systematically reduced defensive positions with their 75mm guns. When one Sherman was hit and disabled by German anti-tank fire, the others quickly maneuvered to screen the damaged vehicle while it withdrew for repairs. The tactical doctrine employed by American armored units reflected years of development and combat experience. The Sherman tank, while not the most heavily armored or powerfully armed tank of the war, excelled in reliability, ease of manufacture, and operational effectiveness. American crews received extensive training, and their tanks benefited from superior optics, mechanical reliability, and logistical support that kept them operational at much higher rates than Axis armor. For Italian tankers like Giuseppe, facing this combination of technological superiority and professional competence was devastating to morale. By late afternoon on February 3rd, the American attack had stalled against fierce German resistance, but Italian forces had played only a marginal role in the defense. Giuseppe's tank company had fired perhaps 20 rounds during the entire engagement, none directed at enemy armor. They had survived the day, but survival felt hollow when it came at the cost of irrelevance. Marco Benedetti expressed the frustration they all felt. "We're useless. We sit and watch while the Germans do the real fighting. Our tanks are good for nothing against the Americans." Giuseppe had no counter-argument because Marco was right. The M1340 had been marginally adequate for colonial warfare in Ethiopia, or limited engagements against poorly equipped opponents, but against the American military machine, it was an obsolete relic that endangered its crew without providing meaningful combat capability. The dawn of February 16, 1944, erupted with the thunder of the largest German counteroffensive since the Anzio landings as Field Marshal Albert Kesselring launched Operation Fishfang, an ambitious attempt to drive the Allied forces back into the sea. Giuseppe Ferrara's tank company received orders to support the 94th Infantry Division in an advance toward the Aprilia factory complex, nicknamed the Factory by Allied troops. For the first time since the disastrous engagements at the Mussolini Canal, Italian tanks would participate in an offensive operation, though Giuseppe felt none of the enthusiasm that should accompany such orders. He knew Leone and the other M1340 tanks were being pushed forward primarily because German commanders needed every available unit, regardless of effectiveness. The crew prepared for combat with the grim professionalism of men who had learned to accept their inadequate equipment. Paolo Romano checked the transmission and engine with extra care, knowing that mechanical reliability might mean the difference between escape and death when they inevitably encountered American armor. Marco Benedetti test-fired the main gun, watching the tracer round arc downrange toward an abandoned vehicle serving as a target. The shot hit precisely where he aimed, but everyone knew that accuracy meant nothing when the gun couldn't penetrate enemy armor. Antonio Russo loaded ammunition in a carefully planned sequence, high-explosive rounds for infantry support, armor-piercing rounds stacked behind them in case of emergency. Though emergency really meant desperate last stand, the German offensive began with a devastating artillery barrage that tore apart American forward positions. Giuseppe watched hundreds of shells fall on Allied lines as Leone moved forward with German infantry. The advance initially made good progress, with demoralized American units falling back toward the coast. But the optimism proved short-lived. By mid-morning, American artillery had organized a devastating counter-battery program, and the dreaded Shermans began appearing in increasing numbers to plug gaps in the defensive line. Giuseppe's company was supporting an attack by the 2nd Battalion when the radio burst with panicked reports. American armor counterattacking from the west, multiple Shermans, at least 8 tanks. Colonel Castelli's response came immediately. "All Italian tanks withdraw to the rally point. Germans will handle the armor." But withdrawal proved more difficult than anticipated. American forces had quickly adapted to Axis tactics, and now they coordinated their counterattacks to cut off and isolate attacking units. Leone found itself on an exposed road with Shermans approaching from 2 directions. "Contact right! 3 Shermans, 600 meters!" Marco's shout galvanized the crew into action. Paolo attempted to maneuver behind a stone wall, but the underpowered engine responded sluggishly. The nearest Sherman fired, its 75mm gun sending a shell that impacted 10 meters short, showering Leone with dirt and fragments. Giuseppe made an instant decision that would save their lives. "Abandon tank! Everyone out now!" The crew needed no encouragement, bailing out of Leone with desperate speed and sprinting toward a nearby drainage ditch. From the relative safety of the ditch, Giuseppe watched American tank destroyers methodically engage Italian armor. The M10 tank destroyer, mounting a 3-inch gun in an open-topped turret, proved even more devastating than the Sherman against the thinly armored Italian tanks. One by one, the M1340 tanks of Giuseppe's company died under the precisely aimed fire of American gunners who had trained for exactly this type of engagement. Leone took 3 hits in rapid succession, each penetrating completely and transforming the tank into a burning hulk. Giuseppe felt as if he was watching a friend die, though he knew the loss of the tank potentially meant the end of his military career. Sergeant Benedetti crawled up beside Giuseppe in the ditch, his face blackened with smoke and his eyes hollow with shock. "4 tanks gone, sir. 4 out of 8. The others are pulling back." Giuseppe could only nod. The February offensive had revealed the complete hopelessness of Italian armored forces when confronting American tank units. The technological and tactical gap wasn't merely significant, it was insurmountable. No amount of courage or tactical skill could compensate for guns that couldn't penetrate enemy armor, and protection that couldn't stop enemy fire. The offensive stalled by February 18th as American resistance stiffened and German units exhausted themselves against prepared defensive positions. Historical records from the Anzio beachhead battle indicate that Axis forces came close to achieving a breakthrough, but American resilience and the timely arrival of reinforcements prevented disaster. For Italian tankers, the offensive provided final proof of what they had suspected since January. Their tanks had no place on a modern battlefield dominated by American armor. The psychological impact of this realization spread through Italian armored units like a virus, destroying morale and combat effectiveness more thoroughly than any American attack. The week following the failed February offensive found Giuseppe Ferrara in an unfamiliar role, an armored officer without a tank. Leone was gone, destroyed by American fire, and no replacement vehicles were available. The Italian Social Republic's limited industrial capacity couldn't produce modern tanks in meaningful numbers, and German allies provided no equipment to replace Italian losses. Giuseppe and his surviving crew members were reassigned to an infantry company defending positions in the Alban Hills, a humiliating demotion that reflected the reality of Italy's military situation in February 1944. The crew stayed together, forming a rifle squad under Giuseppe's command. Paolo Romano carried a Carcano rifle that had been obsolete when the war began, while Marco Benedetti was assigned a Breda machine gun whose temperamental nature made it as unreliable as the tanks they had previously crewed. Antonio Russo and Franco Moretti rounded out the squad with additional rifles and a single Panzerfaust anti-tank rocket provided by German allies. They dug foxholes in the rocky soil of the Alban Hills, preparing for American offensives they knew would inevitably come. The psychological adjustment from tanker to infantryman proved difficult for men who had defined themselves by their technical specialization. Giuseppe had spent 3 years learning the intricacies of armored warfare, studying tactics and gunnery, mastering the mechanical complexities of tanks. Now he crouched in a muddy foxhole with a rifle, waiting for American infantry attacks. Marco struggled most with the transition, his precise gunner's mindset poorly suited to the chaotic close-quarters combat of infantry warfare. "I spent years learning to hit targets at 1,000 meters, he complained one evening. Now I'm supposed to throw grenades at Americans 20 meters away. The broader military situation continued to deteriorate for Axis forces in Italy. While the Anzio beachhead remained contained, the stalemate cost both sides heavily in men and material. American forces brought fresh troops and equipment from their seemingly bottomless reserves, while German and Italian defenders scraped together reinforcements from already stretched forces on the Gustav Line to the south. The Italian contribution to the defense became increasingly negligible as equipment shortages and declining morale reduced combat effectiveness to minimal levels. Captain Miller, the German liaison officer Giuseppe had met at Velletri, visited the Italian positions in early March. He brought disturbing news. Field Marshal Kesselring has decided to consolidate defensive positions. Italian units will be withdrawn from frontline positions and assigned to coastal defense sectors. Giuseppe understood the implication immediately. German commanders no longer trusted Italian troops to hold critical positions against American attacks. The relegation to secondary duties represented official acknowledgement of what everyone already knew. The Italian military had ceased to be an effective fighting force. The conversation turned to tanks, a subject that still fascinated Giuseppe despite his current circumstances. Muller explained that Germany was producing new heavy tanks, the Tiger and Panther, that could challenge American armor on equal terms. These tanks mount 88mm guns that can penetrate Sherman armor at 2,000 meters, Muller said with evident pride. But production is limited, and most go to the Eastern Front where the Soviet threat is greatest. Giuseppe felt a pang of envy. German tankers, even those facing Soviet T-34s, at least had equipment capable of fighting effectively. Italian tankers had been sent into battle with obsolete machines and expected to somehow achieve victory through courage and determination alone. The friendship between Giuseppe and Lieutenant Wilhelm Hoffmann, the German tank commander, had deepened through shared experiences at Anzio. Hoffmann visited whenever his duties permitted, bringing German rations that were marginally better than Italian supplies. During one visit in mid-March, they discussed the fundamental problems that had doomed Italian armor. "Your tanks were designed for a different kind of war," Hoffman observed. "Colonial warfare against poorly armed opponents. No one anticipated modern mechanized combat on this scale." Giuseppe agreed, but noted the bitter irony. Italian military leaders had witnessed German armored success in Poland and France, yet failed to invest in comparable tank development. The technological failure of Italian armor reflected broader issues in Italy's military-industrial complex. The nation's industrial base was limited compared to the major powers, and resources were divided among competing service branches, with the Navy and Air Force receiving priority over the Army in many procurement decisions. When Italy did produce new tank designs, like the P-2627 heavy tank, production remained minimal, and the tanks rarely saw combat before Italy's armistice with the Allies in September 1943. The Italian Social Republic inherited this legacy of industrial inadequacy and could do nothing to remedy it while fighting a desperate defensive war in the ruins of the Italian peninsula. The month of April 1944 brought unseasonably warm weather to the Anzio sector, transforming the battlefield into a landscape of blooming wildflowers that grew among the shell craters and ruined buildings. Giuseppe Ferrara's infantry squad maintained positions in the Alban Hills, enduring periodic American artillery bombardments and occasional patrol actions, but largely experiencing the tedious routine of static warfare. The grand offensives of February had given way to a grinding stalemate as both sides built up strength for the inevitable resumption of major operations. Giuseppe used the relative quiet to reflect on the lessons learned during his brief but devastating experience fighting American armor. The fundamental problem facing Italian tankers had been technological obsolescence combined with industrial incapacity. The M1340 tank, Italy's standard medium tank at the beginning of the war, had been designed in the mid-1930s when armored warfare doctrine was still evolving. Its 47mm gun was adequate against the light tanks common in the early war period, but completely insufficient against the heavily armored vehicles that dominated battlefields by 1944. The tank's armor protection, just 30mm at its thickest point, couldn't stop the 75mm rounds fired by Sherman tanks or the high-velocity projectiles from dedicated tank destroyers. Marco Benedetti, still bitter about their forced transition from tankers to infantry, spent hours analyzing what went wrong. "We were sacrificed," he told Giuseppe during one evening conversation. "The high command knew our tanks were obsolete, but sent us into combat anyway because they had nothing else." Giuseppe couldn't argue with this assessment. Italian military leadership had understood the inadequacy of their armor, but faced an impossible situation: fight with obsolete equipment, or don't fight at all. The decision to commit M1340 tanks against Sherman-equipped American forces had been born of desperation rather than sound military judgment. The crew's experience mirrored that of thousands of Italian tankers who served in the Social Republic's armed forces during the final years of the war. Historical research into this period, including work by Italian military historians examining Archivio dell'Ufficio Storico records, reveals a consistent pattern of Italian armored units being systematically destroyed or rendered combat ineffective when confronting Allied armor. The few encounters where Italian tanks achieved any success came either through ambush tactics against isolated vehicles or when supporting German armor that handled the actual fighting against Allied tanks. Paolo Romano had adapted best to infantry life, his natural mechanical skills proving useful in maintaining the squad's weapons and equipment. But even Paolo sometimes expressed nostalgia for their tanker days, despite the dangers. "At least in Leone we had some protection," he observed. "Out here in a foxhole we're exposed to everything: artillery, aircraft, even small arms fire." Giuseppe understood the sentiment. The tank, for all its deficiencies, had provided a psychological sense of security that infantry lacked. The thick armor might not stop a Sherman 75mm gun, but it offered protection against rifle fire, shell fragments, and the countless other hazards of the battlefield. Captain Muller visited in mid-April with news that German forces were preparing for a major Allied offensive expected in May. "Intelligence indicates the Americans and British will attempt a coordinated breakout from Anzio, combined with an offensive against the Gustav Line." Muller explained. The entire Italian front may collapse if they succeed. Giuseppe recognized the strategic reality. Axis forces in Italy were slowly being ground down by attrition. Every man and tank lost was irreplaceable, while the Allies seemed to have unlimited reserves of both. The question wasn't whether the Allies would break through, but when. The conversation turned to tanks one final time, with Muller sharing information about American tank development. They're producing variants of the Sherman with more powerful guns now, Muller said. The 76mm version can penetrate Panther frontal armor at certain ranges, and they're building thousands of them. Giuseppe performed a mental calculation. If the Sherman, which had already proved vastly superior to Italian tanks, was being upgraded to fight German heavy armor, what hope did any Italian tank have of surviving on a modern battlefield? The answer was obvious. None whatsoever. Lieutenant Hoffman visited for what would be the last time in late April. His Panzer IV had been destroyed in an engagement with American tank destroyers, and he was being transferred to a unit in northern Italy, preparing to defend against the anticipated Allied offensive. The two officers shared a bottle of wine that Hoffman had somehow procured, drinking to fallen comrades and survival against impossible odds. "You were right to abandon your tank when you did," Hoffman told Giuseppe. "Too many tankers stay with their vehicles too long and it kills them. Better to live as infantry than die as a tanker." Giuseppe appreciated the sentiment, but wondered if either choice really offered much hope for survival as the war moved inexorably toward its conclusion. The morning of May 23, 1944, shattered the spring stalemate as Allied forces launched Operation Diadem, a massive coordinated offensive designed to break through the Gustav Line and link up with forces at Anzio. Giuseppe Ferrara's infantry squad heard the bombardment from their positions in the Alban Hills, a continuous thunder that rolled across the landscape like an approaching storm. Within days, the German defensive line had fractured, and Allied troops were advancing rapidly toward Rome. The Anzio beachhead, contained for 4 months at tremendous cost, suddenly became the launching point for a breakout that would finally achieve the objective of the January landings. Giuseppe and his men received orders to withdraw northward as part of a general Axis retreat from the Rome area. They marched through a landscape transformed by months of combat. Burned-out tanks littered the roadsides, villages lay in ruins, and refugees clogged the highways fleeing the advancing Allied armies. Among the destroyed vehicles, Giuseppe spotted the burned hulks of M1340 tanks, their thin armor torn open by American fire, silent monuments to the futility of fighting modern warfare with obsolete equipment. Each wreck represented a crew like his own, men who had climbed into machines they knew were inadequate and tried to do their duty anyway. The retreat became a chaotic affair, as German and Italian units fell back in disarray before the Allied advance. American Sherman tanks led the pursuit, their commanders standing tall in their cupolas, driving north with the confidence of victors who knew the battle had been decided. Giuseppe watched columns of Shermans pass on parallel roads, their numbers seemingly endless. He counted more than 50 tanks in a single formation, more armor than the entire Italian Social Republic could field in all of Italy. The industrial might of America, transformed into military power, rolled past in olive-drab steel columns that represented everything Italian forces had failed to become. Rome fell to Allied forces on June 4, 1944, the first Axis capital to be liberated. Giuseppe's squad was north of the city by then, assigned to new defensive positions in Tuscany, where the retreat would eventually stabilize. The loss of Rome marked more than a military defeat. It represented the complete collapse of any pretense that the Italian Social Republic was a viable fighting force. German commanders now made all significant decisions, with Italian units serving primarily as auxiliaries and security forces rather than combat troops. During a rest period in early June, Giuseppe gathered his crew for a conversation he had been postponing for weeks. They sat in a farmhouse that had somehow survived the fighting, sharing a meal of rations and foraged vegetables. "We need to discuss what happens next," Giuseppe began. "The war is lost. Everyone knows it. The question is whether we continue fighting or try to contact the partisan forces." The suggestion of desertion, even phrased delicately, represented a fundamental break with military discipline. But Giuseppe and his men had reached the point where survival outweighed duty to a regime they increasingly viewed as illegitimate. Marco Benedetti spoke first, his voice carrying the bitterness of months spent fighting in inadequate equipment. "I'm done. Done with the Social Republic. Done with Mussolini. Done with following German orders. They sent us into combat in tanks that couldn't fight, and now they're sending us into battles we can't win. I want to survive this war, and that means getting out while we still can." Paolo, Antonio, and Franco quickly added their agreement. Only Giuseppe hesitated, torn between military honor and practical reality. But the memory of watching Leone burn, destroyed by American fire that their 47mm gun could never hope to counter, ultimately decided him. "We'll move tonight," he said quietly. "Head into the mountains and find partisan contacts. We've done our duty. No one can ask more than we've given." The decision to desert represented not cowardice, but the rational conclusion of men who had witnessed the complete mismatch between Italian military capabilities and modern warfare requirements. The experience of Italian tankers at Anzio had demonstrated beyond any doubt that courage and determination meant nothing when facing enemies equipped with vastly superior technology and supported by overwhelming industrial capacity. Giuseppe, and thousands of Italian soldiers like him, chose survival over continued service to a cause that had already been lost. Historical documentation from the period, particularly records maintained by Italian partisan organizations and post-war military tribunals, shows that desertion from the Italian Social Republic's armed forces increased dramatically after the fall of Rome. Soldiers who had witnessed the futility of resistance against Allied military power concluded that further fighting served no purpose beyond prolonging the inevitable. Many of these deserters, including former tankers like Giuseppe's crew, joined partisan groups fighting against German occupation forces, redirecting their military skills toward a cause that offered some hope of contributing to Italy's eventual liberation. The legacy of Italian tank crews at Anzio extends beyond the immediate tactical defeats they suffered. Their experience illustrated the fundamental importance of technological parity in modern warfare and the catastrophic consequences of entering combat with obsolete equipment. The M1340 tank, adequate perhaps for colonial warfare in the 1930s, became a death trap when confronted by American Sherman tanks that outmatched it in firepower, armor protection, mobility, and reliability. Italian tankers paid for their nation's industrial shortcomings and military unpreparedness with their lives, sacrificed in battles they had no realistic chance of winning. The contrast between Italian and American tank development during the Second World War reflected broader differences in industrial capacity and military-industrial organization. The United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks during the war, a production run that enabled American forces to replace losses quickly and equip numerous Allied nations with modern armor. Italy's entire tank production during the war barely exceeded 3,000 vehicles across all models, and most of these were obsolete by 1944 standards. No amount of tactical skill or operational creativity could overcome such a dramatic disparity in resources and technological sophistication. Giuseppe Ferrara and his crew successfully contacted partisan forces in the mountains of Tuscany in July 1944. They spent the remainder of the war fighting German occupation troops in a guerrilla campaign that bore no resemblance to their earlier service as tankers. The skills they had learned operating complex armored vehicles proved largely irrelevant to partisan warfare, but their military training and combat experience made them valuable members of the resistance. Giuseppe survived the war and returned to his hometown near Naples, where he rarely spoke about his experiences as a tanker. The memory of climbing into Leone, knowing the tank was inadequate for its mission, haunted him for decades, a reminder of how military leadership could fail the men under their command. The fate of Italian armor at Anzio remained largely forgotten in post-war histories that focused on German resistance and American perseverance. Italian tankers had been bit players in a drama dominated by larger and more powerful military forces. Yet their experience offered important lessons about the relationship between technology, industry, and military effectiveness. Modern armies require not just brave soldiers, but adequate equipment, continuous modernization, and industrial capacity to sustain combat operations. Italy in 1944 possessed none of these prerequisites, and its tankers paid the price for this failure. The burned-out wrecks of M1340 tanks remained scattered across the Italian countryside for years after the war. gradually consumed by rust and scrap metal collectors. These forgotten hulks represented more than failed military hardware. They symbolized the broken promises of fascist military ambition and the human cost of sending men into battle with inadequate tools. For the crews who had fought in these obsolete machines, survival itself became a form of victory, proof that they had somehow endured an impossible situation through skill, luck, and the wisdom to know when continued resistance meant certain death. The Sherman tanks that had dominated Italian armor at Anzio went on to serve throughout the remainder of the war in Europe, participating in the liberation of France, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Many remained in service for decades after 1945, seeing combat in Korea, the Middle East, and numerous other conflicts. The M1340, by contrast, disappeared from military service as soon as the war ended, remembered only by historians studying obscure details of Italian military history, and by the aging veterans who had crewed them. The technological verdict rendered at Anzio in January 1944 proved final and irrevocable. Italian armor had no place on a battlefield dominated by modern American tanks, and the men who fought in them had learned this lesson at terrible cost. Giuseppe Ferrara died in 1989, taking with him the memories of those desperate days at Anzio when he and his crew realized their tank was hopelessly outmatched. His granddaughter, while sorting through his effects, found a photograph of Leone taken before the January battles, showing the crew posed beside their tank with the confidence of men who had not yet experienced combat against superior forces. On the back, Giuseppe had written a single sentence in his careful handwriting: "We did our duty with what we had, but what we had was never enough." That epitaph applied not just to his crew but to every Italian tanker who fought during the Second World War, men who faced impossible odds with obsolete equipment, and somehow found the courage to continue despite knowing the outcome had already been determined by forces far beyond their control.